Hello, I'm Susan Vita, Chief of the Music Division at the Library of Congress. Welcome to one of 3 new lectures that we are delighted to add to the Library of Congress and American Musicological Society lecture series. The co-sponsored series has afforded us the pleasure of learning more about the new and exciting research that has stemmed from the Music Division's collections. With over 25 million items, our collections provide endless research possibilities for musicologists, and that vastness and variety have been well reflected in the lecture series since it began in 2008. Past AMS lectures, as well as our 3 new presentations, are available to stream on the library's website as well as the library's YouTube channel. Learn about outstanding research with our Samuel Barber manuscripts, the Seeger family collection, Arnold Schoenberg correspondence, and much more. Today we are excited to revisit a work that's near and dear to the library's heart since we commissioned it. Martha Graham's ballet Appalachian Spring with music by Aaron Copland. For Marta Robertson, a professor of music in the Suderman Conservatory at Gettysburg College, teaching, scholarship, and performance are collaborative, participatory, and contextual. In her research and classroom, global dance and music traditions, Euro-American art music, and American popular music coexist fluidly. Robertson's scholarly and creative activities explore the intersections between movement and music in diverse traditions, including Okanagan diasporic communities, World War II Japanese American incarceration camps, and the collaborative process of composer Aaron Copland and choreographer Martha Graham in Appalachian Spring. Her current book project, Fenced In, examines the artistic culture in Japanese American incarceration camps during World War II through ongoing conversations with former incarcerees about their youthful participation in music and dance during detention. Robertson has studied and performed Okanagan classical dance under Grandmaster Kazuko Chibana Volkmar for the past 2 decades. And now I'm happy to welcome Dr. Marta Robertson. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy her presentation, The Uncommon Gift to be Simple, Japanese American Influence in Appalachian Spring.
Hello, thank you for coming to my lecture today, A Gift to be Simple, Japanese American Influence in Appalachian Spring. I want to thank the American Musicological Society and the Library of Congress for sponsoring these lectures. And I really want to celebrate the librarians and technology specialists that have kept us together in this year of pandemic. They've kept us connected to our resources and to each other. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to share a portion of my work in progress with you today. Given the ongoing calls for racial and social justice, I consider this project and my use of critical race theory as an intervention in the whiteness and privilege of the standard music history narrative. So let's get started. Appalachian Spring, with a score by Aaron Copland and choreography by Martha Graham, is commonly assumed to be a fundamentally Anglo-American myth of Western expansion. Today, I propose to reframe this iconic frontier myth through a Japanese American gaze. In order to interrogate these 2 seemingly contradictory views, whiteness on one hand and transculturalism on the other, I examine daily life in the Japanese American incarceration camps, where the sculptor Isamu Noguchi and the modern dancer choreographer Yuriko Kikuchi were held immediately before collaborating with Graham on Appalachian Spring. I will argue that Graham's self-conscious affiliation with Japanese culture and her Japanese American collaborators coalesced into an unexpected transculturalism during the height of American wartime anti-Japanese racism. So imagine with me for a moment that you were in that opening night premiere audience in the Library of Congress's Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Auditorium in Washington, DC. This was nearly 75 years ago, and the audience settled into their seats to hear Copland's Pulitzer Prize, what would become his Pulitzer Prize winning score, and to see Graham's narrative, the affirmation of American democratic ideals threatened by Nazism. The reenactment of a frontier ritual of marriage and rebirth with its ultimate message of hope, triumphing over doom, unified the audience through nationalism, optimism, and nostalgia. So imagine if you could just pull back the years and listen to the opening chords of Copland's now famous score and see with fresh eyes Noguchi's set. As Graham's characters, you'll see the revivalist and the pioneering woman walking onto stage in this opening clip from Appalachian Spring. In the next clip, just for a little bit of context, you'll see the husbandman coming onto stage, followed by Martha Graham, dancing the role of the bride. And behind her, 4 identical followers led into the stage by Yuriko. That same night, the premiere of Appalachian Spring, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was heroically fighting behind enemy lines, German enemy lines, to rescue the lost battalion. The men of the 442nd had volunteered not only from Hawaii, but from the incarceration camps on the mainland, where their family members were still held. So as I will demonstrate, the arc of Japanese American incarceration and the genesis of Appalachian Spring were concurrent. So before moving on, I just want to say about the word about the terminology that I'm using here. You may have already noticed that I'm saying incarceration rather than internment, detainees rather than internees, and absolutely not pioneers. These were euphemistic terms that the American government concocted as PR during World War II. And obviously they are not the preferred terms of the Japanese American community. I'm also saying Appalachian for the name of the composition and Appalachian for the geographic location. So this lecture is structured around 3 lines of inquiry, probing the artistic and historical context of Appalachian Spring, but also through my shifting journey as a musicologist through the primary sources of the Library of Congress. In the first inquiry, An American Dream, I examined the collaboration between Copeland and Graham that would develop into the Appalachian Spring we recognize today. I ask, how did extra musical factors, including Graham's scripts, personal relationships, and the World War II home front, how did they influence the structural elements of music and choreography? This web of relationships can be traced through primary sources, such as Graham's scripts, Copeland's manuscript scores, their correspondence, and documentary photographs. These are the trademark tools of a historical musicologist. My second line of inquiry, An American Nightmare, examines daily life of the Japanese Americans in the incarceration camps through the power of music and dance. I ask questions like, how did celebrated incarcerees, including sculptor Noguchi and dancer Yuriko, and avid amateurs around them, how did they harness the arts to negotiate, express, and even resist cultural and individual identities during and after camp? Primary sources at the Library of Congress, such as camp newspapers, documentary photographs, including those of Ansel Adams, in addition to government documents down the road from the Library of Congress at the National Archive. But those primary sources only partially answer the questions I wanted to ask. So stepping into my second role as an ethnomusicologist, I was able to interview former incarcerees about their embodied memories of making music and dancing in the camps. And these have become my most treasured primary resources. And I can't thank you enough. The third line of inquiry, Who's America?, examines Appalachian Spring for the influence of Japanese and Japanese Americans. After having examined the complexities of these identities during incarceration in the second inquiry, I will employ the Japanese concept of Ma, it's a space-time aesthetic, to demonstrate the Japanese/Japanese American gaze across the choreography, score, and sets of Appalachian Spring. Here, I assume a third role as a public musicologist, asking, why does it matter? I believe that the simple gift of the archive is the opportunity to engage new questions and to form new relationships with ourselves and with others, both in the present and the historical past. So I can still remember that moment as a graduate student in the performing arts reading room, and I found the score. Eureka! I was looking at Copeland Collection, box 255/22, page 4, and I share it here with you. It's part of a 12-page script from Graham that was simply called Name. Graham directed Copeland toward what would become the best loved section of Appalachian Spring, the theme and variations on a Shaker hymn, Simple Gifts. So if you follow along with my orange highlights, you'll see that Graham requested from Copeland the affect, simplicities, the structural form, theme and variations, the song-like quality, and its context, a Shaker meeting. She also located this section approximately 2/3 through the score, which is precisely where the theme and variations would appear in Copeland's completed manuscript score. She further signaled the material's rondo-like return. She said, the core of the piece that should enter again at the end, end quote. Unlike Copeland's previous Americana ballets, Graham requested only the essence of folk music, quote, so beautifully woven on the loom of this country, end quote. These primary sources trouble the assumption that something as pervasive as Copeland's theme and variations is somehow inevitable. It's worth remembering that simple gifts, and perhaps you know it as Lord of the Dance, that something so firmly entrenched in mass culture was previously unfamiliar. Such primary sources and their companions also document the extent to which Graham, a woman and a dancer no less, directed Copland's compositional process of his score, which he simply called Ballet for Martha at this point. This continues to be a major insight because Appalachian Spring is still best known as an abstract orchestral suite, divorced from its choreographic context. In fact, Copland obscured the extent of Graham's structural and programmatic influence by deleting sectional headings in his published manuscript score, orchestral score. And you see those headings here in the left column of the slide. Archives also provide the gift of hindsight, seeing not only the development of beloved ideas, but those ideas left on the cutting room floor. So you know from this excerpt here that Copland boldly rejected Graham's references to an Indian girl. You see that in the middle of the script. And he also rejected a narrator speaking lines from Genesis, flesh of my flesh. So even as Copland replicated the atmosphere and structure in Graham's outline of action that you see here, he still rejected parts and helped Graham really move towards the trademark simplicity of Appalachian Spring that his score inspired. Also on the cutting room floor were two of Graham's earliest proposals to Copland for collaboration. They were really dark. At the time, in February 1941, Graham was working out anxieties about her romantic and artistic relationship with Eric Hawkins. Troublingly, Graham described Medea's relationship to Jason as, quote, any wife's letter to any husband. It is bitter, sardonic, murderous, and despairing, end quote. 4 years later, a still anxious bride weds the husbandman and dances joyously to Copland's theme and variations in Appalachian Spring. Graham and Hawkins divorced shortly after. This Medea script also points towards an abstraction of Japanese and Greek theater underlying the surface of Appalachian Spring from its very inception. Graham wrote, quote, this is almost like a Japanese no drama piece called a revenge piece, end quote. As we will soon discover, Graham abstracted the Japanese no influence in her choreography, but she transferred it directly to set designer Noguchi. Let me introduce one of my favorite musical choreographic moments in Appalachian Spring and offer it as an example of how primary sources change our minds, and in this case, literally changed my hypothesis. So throughout Appalachian Spring, you may notice that there are moments of slippage when Graham's choreography and Copland's score just don't seem to line up. I assumed that Graham was micromanaging the rest in Copland's score. So watch this clip and notice how the followers lying prone on the floor beat their air by their ears with cupped hands in silence. as I said, initially, I assumed that Graham had micromanaged that space in between Copland's music and in between his notes. But if you go all the way back to Copland's earliest sketches for Appalachian Spring, his rough sketches, you'll see that there's spaces in his sketches where he leaves directions about the dancer. Daughter enters in silence, daughter runs across the floor. These stay in the sketches and the manuscript scores. And then here you see in a final rehearsal copy in Copland's hand, the section we were just listening to right here. In Copland's hand, it says hand clapping, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. I really enjoy this moment because Copland notated the bodily percussion of the dancers. It was part of his original concept of Appalachian Spring. So in October 1943, Copland goes to Graham's studio and plays her first hearing of parts of Appalachian Spring, which would have included this section. So indulge me for a moment when I enjoy the thought of Copland perhaps banging on the cabinetry of the piano when he got to this rest. And most likely, Graham would have heard that bodily percussion from Copland for her dancers from her very first hearing of the score. Inquiry 2, An American Nightmare. As I said before, the genesis and premiere of Appalachian Spring coincide with the increasing victories of the Allies, but also with the intensifying infamy of Japanese American incarceration in the United States. Given that Yuriko and Noguchi joined Graham from their respective incarceration camps, just as she was creating Appalachian Spring, I wondered, how did their experience of incarceration affect the composition's Americana? Working ethnographically with former incarcerees who experienced the camps and who know the music and dance in their very own bodies has brought life to the tangible remains of the history in the archive. In a sense, it creates an alternative performance archive. My inclusion of the incarceration here goes beyond that of a critical event in Japanese American history, somehow paralleling white mainstream history. What I'm presenting here, in fact, is a redress of sorts, for the incarceration is not simply a Japanese American story. It is a fundamentally American story. While incarceration was one systemic event of dispossession, forced displacement, dispersal, and residual trauma, there were various tracks through the different types of incarceration facilities. So beginning December 7th, 1941, the night that Pearl Harbor was attacked, prominent first generation community leaders, the name is Issei for first generation, were arrested and detained as enemy aliens. For up to 6 years, they were shuttled through Department of Justice and Army camps scattered across primarily the Western United States. When Executive Order 9066 was issued in February 1942, the remaining Issei men and women and their American-born Nisei children were evicted from West Coast military zones. 15 temporary assembly centers, or worse, hospitality centers, were hastily repurposed, many from fairgrounds like at Tulare, or racetracks, as you see here in Santa Anita, where prisoners, including Yuriko and Tulare, lived in converted horse stalls for several months before being moved en masse further inland to War Relocation Authority camps. Ultimately, 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were born citizens, and half of that 2/3 were children, were forcibly removed from their lives and livelihoods, many incarcerated for 3 or more years. The incarceration of innocent civilians was among the worst challenges to the American democratic principles of human rights for which the US was fighting abroad. So in this slide, I've lined up the Japanese American incarceration side by side with the genesis and reception of Appalachian Spring, so that you can see the arc, the parallel arc. On July 23rd, 1942, Copeland was offered a commission from the Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Foundation. A month later, Yuriko was transferred from Tulare Detention Center to the WRA camp at Gila River, Arizona. Noguchi, who volunteered for incarceration, was held at Poston Incarceration Camp in Arizona from May through November 1942. During the first half of 1943, as Copeland and Graham negotiated the scenario and initial sketches for Appalachian Spring, second generation Nisei, including Yuriko, were being released from the WRA camps for military service, work, and education on the outside. Yuriko left Gila on September 21st, 1943, headed to New York, and ultimately a lifetime of collaboration with Martha Graham. The reception of Appalachian Spring similarly followed the closing arc of World War II. On May 8th, 1945, it was announced that Copeland's score for the chamber score for Appalachian Spring had received the Pulitzer Prize on the very same day that victory in Europe was announced. A week later, on May 14th, 1945, Appalachian Spring received its choreographic premiere in New York, amidst 88 days of the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War on Okinawa. On October 4th, 1945, as the WRA incarceration camps were officially closing, Copeland's orchestral suite for Appalachian Spring was premiered on a concert celebrating the end of the war. Surrounded by barbed wire fences, secured by armed guards and searchlights, the music and dance at most of the WRA camps was that of an urban soundscape relocated to a remote, arid desert. The sounds that would be heard were human, non-human, constructed, natural, inside and outside of the barbed wire fence. Counterintuitively, Nisei participated in the first sphere of Japanese classical arts in such surprising numbers that Japanese traditional arts flourished in the hostile institution of the camps. Daily life in this densely packed soundscape resonated with a cacophony of rhythms and tones that wafted through these tar paper barracks, to the point that some incarcerees, such as Lily Havey, who I've interviewed, it actually constituted oral trauma and PTSD. Havey recalled that 3 times a day, mess hall bells competed with each other. She wrote, quote, "Clang, clang, ding, ding, bong, ka-chong," end quote. After dark, she wrote, quote, "The searchlights blinked across the window, over and over. Light, dark, light, dark." And the beat went on and on, end quote. Scrabbling dust storms and coyote yips competed with soundtracks from the movie nights, children's play songs, Christmas caroling among the barracks, with master koto and shakuhachi players, and piano lessons with amateur swing bands, dancers, and the voices of pop crooners, with hymns from Protestant churches and sutras from the Buddhist temples. All of these and the context are central to understanding how incarcerees navigated daily life under confinement. Underutilized and traumatized detainees used music and dance to fill time, as temporary distraction, for solace and fun. But in this context, sound was also power. Incarcerated Nisei employed sound and movement to create a socially cohesive community, to contest socio-political identities forced on them, and to assert their bicultural affiliations to traditional Japanese culture and home front patriotic American principles. Through their music and dance, Nisei forged a cultural hybridity that honored the heritage of their first generation Issei parents, while also advancing the American mainstreams of jazz, popular, and art music. Nisei performed a complicated mixture of ethnic pride danced in Obon celebrations, chauvinistic white Americanism crooned to Bing Crosby's recordings, and affiliation with Black racial struggle aligned with activist singer Paul Robeson's iconic performances of Ballad for Americans. Here's the big idea for the second line of inquiry. Music and dance in the camps, on the inside, tells not simply a Japanese American story, but a larger American story. So how then do we refrain American music to include the centuries-old Japanese repertoires that flourished inside the barbed wire? These repertoires themselves, an American political institution, a venue that was typically American at this time period. I was struck by this question when during a Koto lesson with Dr. Miyuki Yoshikami, she mentioned learning Koto as a child at camp by observing her two older sisters' lessons, very similar to the picture that you see on the second half of the screen. Among Issei incarcerees were master sensei who offered lessons not only in Koto, but other traditional Japanese instruments, dance, flower arranging, theatrical arts, and visual arts, among others. During this time period that I was learning Koto, I began performing Okinawan classical dance with my sensei, Grandmaster Kazuko Chibana Volkmar. I observed the opening procession of Appalachian Spring, the clip that I showed you at the beginning of this lecture, through a new embodied knowledge. And I wondered about a potential Japanese American reading. The second sphere of music making and dancing in the camps, practiced avidly by the Nisei, was at the intersection of African American jazz and white popular jazz inflected music. And here I want to thank and introduce former incarcerees Yae Aihara and Lily Havey, also Alice Takamoto and Kay Grantham, who have patiently educated me about their experiences making music and dancing in the incarceration camps. As a researcher, I was underprepared to have my heart broken by the ordinariness of life under these extraordinary, unjust circumstances of incarceration. The longer-term WRA incarceration camps were self-sustaining communities. They included high schools with a football team, with proms, with the queen of the prom, with yearbooks. The high school at Manzanar Camp had an orchestra and a band and a choir. Here you see directed by Louis Frizzell on his first job out of school. Louis Frizzell and his choir, which he recruited primarily from study hall, performed regularly. In addition, Nisei youth jitterbugged their home front loyalties to incarceration camp bands called jive bombers or starlight serenaders, who, in the words of former jazz musician George Yoshida, quote, "hepped out the solid stuff almost nightly for the evacuated cats," end quote. Swing dance captured the hearts and minds and bodies of incarcerated Nisei, just as it did home front youth on the outside beyond the barbed wire and armed sentries. The third artistic sphere in the incarceration camps, European American classical arts, eased daily life of the participants, much as the other two spheres. At Poston incarceration camp, Noguchi completed a bust of Ginger Rogers from pink Georgia marble and tools he had shipped to himself. Working on the portrait helped sustain Noguchi. On July 14th, 1942, he wrote to Rogers, quote, "The chief misery here in Poston is the heat and monotony, which, if it weren't for the tremendous work I've been doing on your portrait, I could not stand," end quote. Although Noguchi had voluntarily incarcerated himself in solidarity with the Japanese American community, he was marginalized as an outsider in camp. His hopes of establishing an idealized community dashed. Noguchi spent the next months extricating himself in order to return to New York and ultimately a renewed collaboration with Graham. Participating exclusively in European American art, music, and dance, Yuriko taught dance and movement at Tulare Detention Center and Gila incarceration camp. In fact, when Yuriko was voted Queen of the 4th of July festivities at Tulare, she asserted she had never jitterbugged. Keeping herself and her students occupied, Yuriko was paid $19 per month to teach 6 classes per day in a 100-degree barrack. She taught ballet, point, modern, pantomime, and structured play. The Gila Camp newspaper's year-end review highlighted Yuriko's spectacular dance concerts, end quote. Among the 4 recitals she and her students performed was a modern dance interpretation of the score from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite, complete with costumes constructed from crepe paper and curtain materials. Yuriko's Nutcracker Suite contradicts the assumption that Kibei, so second generation Nisei, born in the US, but substantially educated in Japan. It contradicts the assumption that Kibei were particularly unable to assimilate. In fact, Yuriko's American identity and affiliation with German modern dance was strengthened during her youth in Japan. And it was only in an attempt to heighten her Japaneseness that she briefly studied and taught traditional Japanese dance on return to California. Professionalism of Yuriko's Nutcracker Suite challenges potential presumptions of an aesthetic void in the incarceration setting. Despite heightened suspicions against the Kibei, the art that Yuriko and Noguchi created during incarceration testifies to the extent of their Americanization and the globalization of European American art. Inquiry 3. In this inquiry, I decentered Graham's perspective of Japan and Japaneseness, her continuum from crassly orientalized to respectfully authentic influence, all filtered through her whiteness. Instead, I propose a Japanese American gaze to make audible and visible the contributions of Yuriko and Noguchi to the aesthetic of Appalachian Spring. Having examined Noguchi's and Yuriko's experience of daily life and the arts during incarceration in Inquiry 2, we are reminded of the complicated intersectional perspectives of Japanese Americans, that particular mix of Japanese, Anglo, and African American influences. I hope to trouble the presumed whiteness of the American home front during the height of anti-Japanese racism and to challenge lingering racist assumptions of an enemy alien from old Japan. For instance, Yuriko has commented that Noguchi's frontier fences for Graham did not represent Yuriko's American experience. Rather, Graham's full-bodied jersey tube in Lamentation most paralleled Yuriko's experience of incarceration. Yuriko said, quote, "Lamentation was wrenching and difficult for me to watch because many times I wanted to push, pull, and wring my feelings of entrapment out while in camp. Martha was my voice crying out to be free," end quote. Consider the differences between Noguchi's benign plank fence, enclosing Graham's American dream of a pioneering community in Appalachian Spring, and his sinister barbed wire fence imprisoning Yuriko's nightmare of incarceration in Shut Not Your Doors. As the prologue of Appalachian Spring concludes, the husbandman downstage rests his bent arm on the top rail of the fence, demarcating his domestic space gained through Western expansion and the white American dream. In her solo, Shut Not Your Doors, Yuriko is surrounded by Noguchi's set, upright posts connected by ropes, skewered with spikes, representing the barbed wire fences enclosing the camps. Yuriko's program note explained the trauma of being dispossessed and fenced in. Quote, "This dance concerns the emotional struggles of a bewildered woman, one among millions unjustly uprooted. She experiences the futility of meaning crushed beliefs until her rediscovery of human freedom and dignity is finally achieved," end quote. Yuriko also commented that in Appalachian Spring, Noguchi's use of, quote, "space with the fence" has the sense of a Japanese house with a rock garden, end quote. These parallels are not accidental and help establish a Japanese/Japanese American gaze as a type of double vision that coalesces into a newly imagined third space. So consider the analogy of a stereoscope. You may know those as a ViewMaster or maybe even virtual reality goggles. And think about using those as a way to deconstruct Noguchi's homestead for Appalachian Spring. Through your left eye, you might see the traditional Japanese tea house with an open modular construction and surrounding rock garden, familiar to Noguchi from his youth in Japan. Through the right eye, you might see an historic Appalachian cabin reminiscent of the setting in Graham's script that she sent to Noguchi. Noguchi's original sketches for the set of Appalachian Spring included an architectural diagram labeled the No Stage. The sketch includes a traditional Hashigakari bridgeway covered by a roof covering the main stage, and stairs leading down to the audience level. Very much like you see here in the National No Theater of Japan. Notice how the beams of the roof of the nose stage overhang the vertical posts, much like in the house in Appalachian Spring. This photograph was taken on May 19th, 1942, less than 2 weeks after Noguchi's arrival at Poston incarceration camp, and it shows barracks still under construction. Given no primary source documentation from Noguchi, it's not possible to say whether Poston's frame barracks are echoed in the frame of the new house in Appalachian Spring. The current time frame in a viewing through this Japanese gaze, Japanese American gaze, makes for a potential reading of simultaneities. What I'm suggesting with my Viewmaster analogy is how a set of affinities and experiences coalesce into a single abstracted view, rather than trying to identify causal influences, your chicken and egg question. I am also arguing that applying a blanket term like modernism to Noguchi's set has flattened the personal and globalized cultural backgrounds that fed into his work. Subject matter read through lived experience is one way to establish a Japanese American gaze. For the remainder of the talk, I will further theorize this gaze through the Japanese concept of ma, a space-time aesthetic, across the sets, score, and choreography of Appalachian Spring. Ma is an interstitial tension surrounding objects and sounds. Westerners generally perceive emptiness, so negative space in art, silence in musical rest, and static poses in choreography. Colleen Lanke, however, describes this betweenness as potential, quote, potential presence, potential sound, potential action, end quote, all of which invite audience participation. So imagine a sleepless night, a dripping faucet, and you imagine the potential of that drop forming on the lip of the hydrant. We call it like a pregnant pause, right? And then that tension builds and the drip releases and the potential returns for the next drip in your sleeplessness. So holding on to that idea, I invite you to reconsider the opening prologue of Appalachian Spring, shifting your gaze from emptiness or an absence to fullness. I invite you to welcome this expectant potential of ma in the unpeopled land, transformed by a house frame, anticipating domesticity of the newlyweds. I invite you to occupy the ma, enlivening the palpable spaces among the layers of sound and intersecting planes and isolated characters of Graham's frontier community. Listen to Copland's Rest, not as silence, but the lowest sound volume. See and feel the negative space in Noguchi's set pieces becoming peopled with dancers whose physical stillness is a type of motion. In conclusion, seen through the lens of ma, a gentle, not unpleasant tension tugs lightly below the tranquil surface of Appalachian Spring. Underlying Graham's narrative of white Western expansion and Copland's Americana score, Noguchi's and Yuriko's contributions of personal experience of incarceration argue for a Japanese American gaze that brings fresh insight to what it means to embody and sound American. Graham's Appalachian frontier community was comprehensive and inclusive, offering belonging to Yuriko and Noguchi. I chose this final image by the photographer Toyo Miyataki of one of his sons taken the day of their release from Manzanar incarceration camp. The photo, as with ethnographies and primary sources from the camps, demonstrates the silences in the archive are not negative space, but full of the potential of Ma. Their presence reminds us not to fence anybody in or out. Thank you so much.